The war in Ukraine has gone on far, far longer than anyone expected, including Russian President Vladimir Putin. He's seen his country suffer unbelievable losses and watched on from Moscow as his army experiences one failure after another. He suffered abject humiliation as Ukraine, a much smaller country with a fraction of the Kremlin's military strength and budget, not only defends itself but strikes back, breaking Russia's economy and shattering Putin's power and influence on the global stage. Yet still, he rejects the prospect of peace. Still, he refuses to take a seat at the negotiating table and work out a way to end the bloodshed. So, let's look at the reasons why. On the face of it, Putin should be desperate to bring an end to the war by almost any means necessary. Of course, he can't simply wave a white flag and call his troops home, as that would be akin to admitting defeat, and that's something that the Russian president will never do. He's a man driven by pride and hubris, obsessed with projecting power and seeming in total control of every situation. Apologizing and owning up to his mistakes are simply not parts of the Putin playbook, and there have been reams of evidence to prove that fact over the course of the war so far. In summer 2025, for example, when Russia passed the ugly milestone of more than 1 million casualties, Putin remained defiant, claiming that everything was going according to plan and that not a single Russian soldier had died in vain. However, despite his grand proclamations and boastful statements, behind the scenes, Putin should be able to see how costly, wasteful, and utterly unsustainable his war has become. He should want to bring it to an end before the chaos gets any worse, and he should be eager to accept any olive branch of negotiation extended to him. Yet, time and time again, when given an opportunity to discuss peace and ceasefire deals, he refuses. It seems illogical, but experts around the world have analysed Putin's behaviour and found several viable reasons behind his seemingly irrational decisions. And in reality, it's likely not just one single factor that's influencing Putin's behaviour, but a combination of several significant elements. With that in mind, here are 4 reasons why Putin refuses to end the war. Reason 1. Total conquest. This was never just about the Donbass. When the war began, Putin explained the alleged reasons behind it, stating that Russian forces were stepping in to protect their own people in Ukraine's eastern regions. He spoke of so-called Ukrainian Nazis carrying out a genocide in these territories, claiming that it was the Kremlin's mission to denazify the nation. The purpose of this operation is to protect people who, for 8 years now, have been facing humiliation and genocide perpetrated by the Kyiv regime. To this end, we will seek to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine, as well as bring to trial those who perpetrated numerous bloody crimes against civilians, including against citizens of the Russian Federation. Putin identified 4 regions as the targets of his special military operation: Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. In September 22, he officially annexed those 4 regions, installing his own loyal leaders and proclaiming that the 4 lands would be part of Russia forever. However, Russian forces have also been invading several other regions of Ukraine, including Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Sumy. They've also bombarded the entire territory with drones and missiles on countless occasions, ostensibly attacking cities and killing civilians in places that have nothing to do with Putin's claims of Nazism and genocide in the east. Over time, Putin's rhetoric has shifted too. After initially focusing exclusively on the aforementioned regions in his speeches and statements, he slowly but surely began to infer that he had much greater ambitions in mind, like the total conquest of Ukraine itself. The clearest evidence of this came at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum on June 20, 2025, when Putin took to the stage to announce, "I've said many times that I consider the Russian and Ukrainian peoples to be one people. In this sense, all of Ukraine is ours." Many experts had suspected Putin secretly planned to extend his tendrils far further than the Donbass region, and the statement brought their fears to fruition. Putin has also spoken about building buffer zones all along the border, and would clearly love nothing more than for Ukraine to become a sort of second Belarus, a country that may have its own official title and nationality on paper, but is in effect nothing more than an extension of the Russian Federation, another Russian oblast or region in all but name. This is exactly what Guillaume Duval, advisor to the Jacques Delors Institute, a major European think tank, stated in an article entitled Why Putin does not want peace in Ukraine. Duval first noted that the Donbas regions actually hold little value to Putin in terms of economic resources, especially now that they've been ravaged by war for years on end. Vladimir Putin possesses little genuine interest in the Donbas and Luhansk regions themselves. These territories now lie devastated, their infrastructure reduced to ruins, as evidenced by the current acute shortage of drinking water. Their economies were dominated by coal mining and largely obsolete heavy industries that will contribute precious little to Russia's economic future. The expert then went on to explain Putin's true aims: territorial continuity with Crimea and complete control over the Sea of Azov represent significant gains for Russian imperialism. Nevertheless, these acquisitions remain secondary to Vladimir Putin's primary war objective: gaining control over Ukraine as a whole by transforming it into another Belarus, reintegrating it fully into Russia's sphere of influence without necessarily requiring complete military occupation. Ultimately, this war boils down to one thing: power. Not content with already ruling over what is literally the world's biggest country for more than 2 decades, Putin now wants to take more territory, cementing his legacy as not only the greatest leader in Russia's history, but perhaps the most powerful person to have ever walked the earth. For that, a handful of regions strewn with rubble and wreckage won't suffice. Instead, Putin needs all of Ukraine. It's the only way he can multiply his power and influence on the global stage and effectively ensure he remains in charge of Russia for as long as he wants, quite possibly until the day he dies. It's also the only way he sees to counteract the Western world's alliances and expansions towards Russia. In his view, if Russia hadn't invaded, Ukraine might already be a part of the European Union today, or could even be on the path towards NATO membership. It would be a developing force, reinforced by the many major military powers of the NATO alliance, including the United States, and enjoying the additional benefits of closer ties with the West. That's not something that Putin wants to see on his country's doorstep, as it could threaten his autocratic regime. Thus, invading Ukraine was, in theory, a double win for Russia. It extended the country's massive sphere of influence, while also delaying and disrupting the plans of Europe and NATO. And since Putin hasn't yet even come close to complete conquest of Ukraine, there's no way he'd be willing to give up now. As long as he believes his forces are making some sort of gains on the ground, he'll persist, and that leads us neatly onto our next point. Reason 2. Misinformation. One of the many ways in which Putin maintains his grip of power is through information. He works closely with the Federal Security Service, FSB, Russia's modern-day successor to the Soviet-era KGB, and strives to be informed and up-to-date on everything that matters, receiving regular reports, updates and briefings since the war began from his various commanders and generals. There's just one problem. Putin is a dictator. He's someone who has repeatedly defied the constitutional laws on which the Russian Federation was formed to remain in power longer than any other leader. He has systematically dismantled and rebuilt Russia's legal and political systems to suit his own ends, manipulated elections, repressed the media, eliminated opposition, and violated human rights on incalculable occasions. People who oppose, defy, or even disappoint Putin can end up arrested, imprisoned, or even in some cases dead, including high-profile opposition politicians like Boris Nemtsov and Alexei Navalny, and even members of Putin's own government like the former transport minister Roman Starovoyt, who was found dead mere hours after Putin relieved him of his duties in July 2025. And this sort of thing happens far too often to be coincidental. The Russian leader has resurrected the era of Stalin-style purges, creating a culture where nobody is truly safe, no matter their rank, status, or level of loyalty. Even wealthy elites and Russian army officers who have dedicated their entire lives to defending their motherland are ultimately at the mercy of Putin's moods and whims. In a culture like that, a culture so driven by fear and intimidation, even the bravest of individuals go into self-preservation mode and will do whatever is necessary to protect themselves. And if that includes stretching the truth or exaggerating to tell Putin what he wants to hear, then so be it. So even though the rest of the world knows how badly this war is going for Russia, how many of its soldiers have been maimed and killed, and how little its on-ground gains actually are, Putin may in fact be blissfully unaware of these facts. Why? because the people he counts on to tell him how the war is going prefer to say that everything is fine, that the mighty Russian war machine is steamrolling to great victories all along the front lines. If they tell him what's really going on, he risks getting angry and then taking that anger out on them, either removing them from their positions or worse. As Duval notes, in autocratic regimes such as Putin's, delivering honest assessments to leaders often proves perilous for those brave enough to attempt it. Despite the serious military setbacks his armies have endured over 3 grueling years, hundreds of thousands of soldiers killed and maimed, thousands of tanks destroyed, Putin remains flattered by the courtiers surrounding him and systematically misinformed by his generals' misleading reports. There's plenty of evidence to back this up. Numerous video briefings, for example, show the head of Russia's army, General Valery Gerasimov, telling Putin of major battlefield victories in Ukraine, literally inventing statistics with no root in reality. In late October 2025, for instance, Gerasimov brazenly told Putin that Russian forces had seized over 70% of the city of Vovchansk in the Kharkiv region. Numerous sources, including the Institute for the Study of War, ISW, immediately discredited these claims. In a roundup of the latest news from the front lines, the ISW wrote, ISW has not observed evidence to support Gerasimov's claims. ISW has only observed evidence to assess that Russian forces have seized roughly 23% of Vovchansk. The Institute also noted that even hardened Russian military bloggers were calling out Gerasimov's misinformation. But the key point here isn't about fact and reality, it's about what Putin believes. And if Putin is repeatedly told by those in charge of his war that it's going well, then why would he see any reason to end it? As Duval notes, these military briefings consistently underestimate Russian losses whilst embellishing successes in equal measure. Vladimir Putin therefore probably continues to believe that Russian forces stand on the verge of decisive military victory and that Ukrainian resistance will soon collapse if he maintains relentless pressure. Through his speeches and statements, Putin often conveys the idea that the rest of the world is mad, that they're living in a different reality, that they're refusing to accept the truth of Russia's victories. In reality, this might all be quite simply because he himself is being misinformed by those he's chosen to place trust in, and it's all his own fault. People around Putin are scared to tell him what's actually happening, because they know he's likely to throw a childish tantrum and punish them, rather than admitting he made a bad call. As Duval explains, this exact same idea also applies to the economy. The same dynamic applies to assessments of Russia's economic condition, whose technocratic leaders certainly attempt to conceal from Putin the extent of structural decay and the mounting impact of Western sanctions. This information ecosystem creates a structural tendency for Putin to believe his position far stronger than reality suggests. Again, this all ties in with the evidence we've seen throughout the war. Putin has repeatedly boasted about Russia's economy withstanding Western sanctions, claiming that his country has never been stronger, while Western nations buckled and collapsed. Those in positions of power within the financial and economic sectors have sought to placate the country's leader, only rarely acknowledging the grim truth that it sits on the brink of recession and will struggle to survive if the current defense spending rates continue, which ties into reason number 3. Reason 3. Putin's gambit. If the Russia-Ukraine war was a poker game, Putin has undoubtedly gone all in. He's thrown everything he has at this conflict, committing hundreds of billions of dollars to the cause. Defense is now by far the biggest industry in Russia, and while other sectors have suffered, like agriculture, mining and manufacture, those in the business of bombs, drones and weapon systems have never been so successful. In the coming years, Russia is set to spend around 40% of its federal budget purely on national defense and law enforcement, and in a hole that deep, it's very hard to dig your way out. In other words, the Kremlin is so invested in the war at the moment, it arguably can't afford to end it. A recession is almost inevitable, but Russia can just about stave it off by keeping the conflict going for the time being, since so many jobs and so much money is tied up in the vast military-industrial complex. If the war ended, that complex would become dramatically less important overnight. Other sectors that have shrunk since the war began would recover their relevance, and the multitude of ugly and possible crises facing Russia today would be revealed in all their glory. That in turn could quite realistically spell the end of the Putin regime. The economic and social consequences would be incalculable. The war has, in effect, covered up so many issues. The big salaries and signing bonuses paid to soldiers and their families, for example, have allowed people in impoverished regions to continue with their lives. They've seen prices go up and may have found it harder to afford everyday essentials, but haven't been entirely exposed to the massive deterioration of the Russian economy and civilian infrastructure. If and when the war ends, Putin's cover goes with it, and Russians across the country will wake up to a very miserable new chapter in their country's troubled history. It's not just a question of economic issues either. Socially, Russia also stands to be torn apart when the war comes to a close. Think, for example, of the hundreds of thousands of demobilized veterans that head back home, many suffering the ill effects of the war, suffering post-traumatic stress disorders and other serious mental health conditions that are commonplace in those who have seen and experienced the horrors of war firsthand. Many would turn to drugs and alcohol to cope. Many of Russia's soldiers have also reportedly been diagnosed with serious chronic illnesses, including HIV and hepatitis. Their return home will pile immense pressure on Russia's healthcare system, and after suffering so much, many will never be able to reintegrate into society, potentially becoming abusive, violent, and worse. Few would be in any fit state to make a meaningful contribution to the economy or solve the country's critical labour shortages. Instead, they'd only add to the Kremlin's burden. Reason 4. China won't allow it. As countries across the West have severed ties with Russia and imposed strict sanctions on the country, the Kremlin has been forced to strengthen bonds with those in the East, most notably China and India, who have become by far the biggest buyers of Russian oil and other resources. Russia also imports increasing amounts of vital supplies from these nations, especially China. And as Russia grows more reliant on the Asian nation, Putin is under increasing pressure to essentially bow to the demands of its leader, Xi Jinping. As Deval puts it, through this conflict, Russia has become profoundly dependent upon China for most essential supplies and for purchasing its gas and oil exports. Weakened by prolonged warfare, Russia teeters on the brink of becoming Beijing's vassal state, notwithstanding its nuclear arsenal and its president's grandiose imperial aspirations. Following this logic, it's easy to see why Putin might feel an additional level of pressure to persist with the war, since it actually provides several benefits for China. For starters, any sort of major war in Europe distracts the world from China's expansions in Asia, and could even open up an opportunity for the country to invade and take over Taiwan, which has been one of Xi Jinping's ultimate ambitions for some time. The war also soaks up NATO resources, since the US and other countries are busy sending funds, weapons and so on to Ukraine, effectively leaving less left over for allies in the Indo-Pacific region. Plus, this conflict has given China the opportunity to build its bonds with Russia, exploiting Putin's position of weakness to bolster its own economy and future prospects. In short, the war is working out well for the Chinese in more ways than one, and should continue to do so for as long as it rages on. As such, Xi won't want to see it come to an end. He especially won't want Putin to agree to any kind of peace deal negotiated or brokered by US President Donald Trump. If Trump was able to claim that he ended the war, or at least played a large part in it, that would massively strengthen his and America's position on the global stage, while also rebuilding bridges between Putin and the Western world in the process. China can't have that. So even though Beijing may have made statements in the past about wanting to see the war come to an end, it may have very different feelings behind the scenes. All of these reasons combined mean that Putin still has more than enough motivation to keep the war going, while also ensuring that any attempts at peace talks are, unfortunately, likely to fail. Instead, the only way to end this war may be with a decisive military defeat and increasingly intense sanctions on Russia that eventually become too much for the Kremlin to bear. In the meantime, the country will continue to crumble and Putin will continue to paper over the cracks. Now, learn more about how Russia is falling apart in our detailed video breakdown, exploring how the country is, in the words of NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, running out of money, troops and ideas. Or check out this video for an inside look at how Ukrainian forces are using sabotage, covert operations and intelligence to undermine Russia from within.